It is a July morning in 1974 at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington. A pre-dawn drizzle has given way to overcast skies. At 8 o'clock, a U.S. Air Force jet lifts off the runway and turns east. On board sits William Simon, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States for barely 2 months, and his deputy, a young lawyer named Jerry Parsky. The official mission, the one in the press releases, is a 2-week tour of economic diplomacy through the Middle East and Europe. Talks about oil prices, handshakes, photographs. The real mission is known only to President Nixon's innermost circle. Buried inside that itinerary is a 4-day stop in Jeddah, a coastal city in Saudi Arabia. And in those 4 days, Simon has to do something no Treasury Secretary has ever attempted. He has to convince a kingdom that has just spent 5 months strangling the American economy, a kingdom that considers itself at economic war with Washington, to take the billions of dollars it is earning from oil and quietly lend them back to the United States government. Failure is not on the menu. Parsky would put it simply, decades later. This, quote, wasn't a question of whether it could be done or it couldn't be done. It had to be done. What was agreed in Jeddah, that July stayed secret for 42 years, not classified in the ordinary way, hidden, erased from the statistics, disguised inside the accounting of the United States Treasury itself, so thoroughly that Congress's own investigators would later be turned away at the door. It only came into the light in 2016 when a Bloomberg journalist filed a Freedom of Information request. Now jump forward to June 2024. Suddenly, the internet is on fire. Viral posts, millions of views, picked up by financial newsletters announce that a 50-year petrodollar agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia has expired on June 9, 2024. That Saudi Arabia is about to sell its oil in Chinese yuan, that the dollar's reign is over, effective immediately. The fact-checkers went looking for this expiring treaty, and they found something remarkable. It does not exist. It never existed. There has never been a formal agreement obliging Saudi Arabia to sell its oil in dollars. There was nothing to expire. And yet the petrodollar is real. The system is real. For half a century, the great majority of the world's oil, around 80% of it, has been invoiced in American dollars, and that fact has underwritten American power in ways most people never think about. So hold both of those truths at once. No treaty was ever signed, and the system has held for 50 years. How do you make the whole world buy oil in your currency without ever signing anything? That is the story. The story of a flight at 8 in the morning, a king who demanded absolute secrecy, a bond salesman with an ego the size of Wall Street, and an accounting trick that hid one of America's largest creditors in plain sight for 4 decades. Here is the full story. Because the engine of this story is not diplomacy, and it is not ideology. It is money specifically, a debt problem, and a surplus problem that happen to be mirror images of each other. In 1974, the United States needed someone to buy its debt because the dollar had just lost the only anchor it ever had, and Saudi Arabia needed somewhere to put a flood of money so enormous it could destabilize the world economy. The deal that married those two problems was never a treaty. It was a machine, a system of incentives built in secret, hidden from Congress, hidden from America's own allies, designed so that every participant would stay inside it out of pure self-interest. That machine is the villain and the hero of this film, depending on where you were standing. To understand it, you first have to understand why the dollar needed rescuing at all. To do that, we have to go back 3 years before that flight, to a weekend in the mountains of Maryland that we have covered in full in another film on this channel. Here's the short version, because this story does not work without it. On the 13th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon shuts himself away at Camp David with 15 advisors, among them Treasury Secretary John Connally, Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, and a Treasury official named Paul Volcker. Remember that last name? He returns to this story a decade later, carrying a hammer. On Sunday evening, August 15th, Nixon goes on television and announces 3 battles at once. Quote, "We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators." And then he orders Connally to, quote, "suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. America's gold reserves had been draining away for years. By 1971, they had reportedly fallen to less than half of their post-war peak. The window closes. Temporarily, that word is doing a lot of work. The gold window never reopens. Not in 1972. Not ever. By March 1973, the world's major currencies are floating freely against each other, and the entire architecture of Bretton Woods is a memory. Here's what that means in plain language. From August 1971 onward, nothing guarantees the value of a dollar. No metal, no fixed rate, nothing except what the rest of the world is willing to sell for it. The dollar is now backed by confidence alone. So the question that should haunt you is this: why did the world keep stacking dollars anyway? Why did central banks from Tokyo to Frankfurt keep piling up a currency that was no longer convertible into anything? The answer, in a single word, is oil. The one commodity every industrial economy on Earth must buy week after week, forever. Nothing about oil could guarantee what a dollar was worth, but it could guarantee that the world would keep needing dollars. And a currency the world permanently needs is a currency the world keeps holding. But first, that same oil was going to be turned into a weapon and pointed straight at the United States. October 1973, the 8th of the month. In Vienna, the oil ministers of OPEC sit down with the men from the great Western oil companies, George Piercy for Exxon among them. 2 days earlier, on October 6th, Egypt and Syria have attacked Israel. The Yom Kippur War is burning while they talk. At the table, Saudi Arabia's oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani and Iran's Jamshid Amuzegar deliver OPEC's demand, roughly double the posted price of oil to around $6 a barrel. The companies offer 25% at most. The talks collapse. What happens next has never happened before in the oil industry. On the 16th of October, in Kuwait City, 6 Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and Qatar, set the price themselves unilaterally. No negotiation, no companies in the room. 70% up from the $3.01 posted on October 1st to $5.12 a barrel. The next day, October 17th, the Arab producers go further, production cuts of 5% per month, every month, for as long as Israel occupies the territories taken in 1967. The oil weapon, the weapon King Faisal of Saudi Arabia had explicitly warned he would use, is out of its sheath. And on the 19th and 20th of October, the trigger is pulled all the way. Nixon asks Congress for $2.2 billion in emergency military aid for Israel. Faisal's answer is a total embargo on oil shipments to the United States. You have seen the photographs of what came next. Lines of cars wrapped around American gas stations. Hand-painted signs reading "No gas today." A new national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. The President of the United States asking citizens not to put lights on their Christmas trees. The embargo would be lifted in March 1974, but by then, the damage had changed the world. Because the worst blow was not the embargo. It came 2 days before Christmas. On the 22nd and 23rd of December 1973, the Gulf producers meet again, this time in Tehran, as guests of the Shah of Iran. And there they take the posted price of benchmark crude from $5.12 to $11.65 a barrel, effective January 1st, 1974. Do the arithmetic. $3.01 a barrel on the 1st of October. $11.65 on New Year's Day. The price of the world's most important commodity has nearly quadrupled in under 3 months. The man pushing that number is the Shah himself, jubilant that night, the host of the summit, armed with calculations of what alternative energy would cost. And he does not leave the announcement to his oil minister. On the 23rd of December, he holds his own press conference in Tehran to deliver it personally. His message to the industrial West: the age of cheap oil is over. Find other sources of energy, tighten your belt, work harder, not a threat, a verdict. The consequences are almost too large to grasp. According to a contemporary State Department assessment, the world's oil bill for 1974 will more than double to roughly $100 billion, about 1/5 of everything the free world spends on imports of any kind. The revenues of the OPEC states leap several-fold in a single year. How many depends on what you count. From $14 billion in 1972 to nearly $70 billion by the end of 1974 on one measure, as high as $110 billion on the gross export figures Washington used. Saudi Arabia's take alone goes from $4.3 billion to $22.6 billion. Money on this scale, moving this fast, had never existed. And here is the detail that sets up everything that follows. Because oil had been developed by American companies and priced in American currency since the beginning, that tidal wave of money was a tidal wave of dollars flowing into the treasuries of desert monarchies with a few million inhabitants who could not possibly spend it fast enough. Tens of billions of dollars piling up month after month in the hands of governments hostile to Washington. Where would that money go? Whoever answered that question would shape the next half-century. And here is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because in Washington, in the first half of 1974, the answer looked like it might be nowhere good. Picture the America that Simon's plane leaves behind. Inflation is running at double digits. The stock market is in one of the worst collapses since 1929. The president is drowning in Watergate. And the government's own economists are wargaming a nightmare. What happens if the OPEC surplus just sits there, or worse, moves violently from one currency to another, smashing whatever it leaves? Congress is holding hearings that same summer under a title that says everything. International Petrodollar Crisis. The word itself is brand new, coined in 1973. The Georgetown economist Ibrahim Owais claims it, though some credit the former. Commerce Secretary Peter Peterson. In 18 months, it has gone from a coinage to the official vocabulary of Congress. We cannot read Washington's private fear that spring directly. We can only measure it by the tracks it left over the months that followed. In September 1974 at Camp David, Kissinger and Simon meet with the foreign and finance ministers of America's closest allies. A meeting we know about because the documents were later declassified. Kissinger lays out the number. OPEC countries, quote, will have $110 billion revenue this year compared with $25 billion last year. Within weeks, the allies are building a lifeboat. That November, Kissinger proposes a common facility able to redistribute up to $25 billion in 1975, and as much again the year after, if needed. Washington calls it the safety net for allies being strangled by their oil bills. Strangled. Keep that word in mind. Because at the end of December 1974, Kissinger sits down with Businessweek and refuses to rule out military force against the oil producers. Not, he says, quote, in the case of a dispute over price, but where, quote, there is some actual strangulation of the industrialized world. That one word detonates across the Gulf. King Faisal is reported in the diplomatic record to be extremely disturbed by what he calls American threat. And by August 1975, Congress has a feasibility study on its desk titled Oil Fields as Military Objectives. None of that had been written yet on the July morning we started with, but that is the cliff edge Washington was already drifting toward. Because there was another path, quieter, stranger, and far more durable than gunboats, and the man chosen to walk it is one of the least diplomatic human beings ever to hold high office. William Simon, a chain-smoking bond dealer from New Jersey. Before government, he ran the government bond desk at Salomon Brothers, which means the man being sent to save the dollar is, by trade, the most gifted salesman of United States debt on Wall Street. His self-regard is legendary. According to Bloomberg's investigation, he liked to compare himself to Genghis Khan. Nixon makes him energy czar during the embargo winter, then Treasury Secretary in May 1974. And 1 week before boarding that flight to Saudi Arabia, Simon goes on television and publicly calls the Shah of Iran, the linchpin of the entire Gulf, the West's proudest ally in the region, a nut. That is the emissary. That is the man on the 8 a.m. flight. Before we watch him land, though, there is a public handshake you need to see, because it is the visible half of the deal, and in 2024, half a century later, the whole world will mistake it for the secret one. But the secret half of the deal had a public twin. While Simon prepared his mission, Henry Kissinger was building the official architecture in broad daylight. As early as March 6, 1974, with the embargo not yet even lifted, Kissinger cables the American ambassador in Jeddah with a plan for 3 joint commissions, economic, military, scientific. The declassified telegram is explicit about the goal to, quote, draw Saudis into intensive dialogue and to elbow aside the Europeans who are busy offering the Saudis technology in exchange for guaranteed oil. Early that June, Prince Fahd travels to Washington, and on June 8, 1974, Kissinger and Fahd sign a joint statement creating the U.S.-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. On paper, it is about industrialization, agriculture, manpower training, science, cooperation between friends. But look at the structure, because the structure is the message. This commission is not run by the State Department and not by USAID, the foreign aid agency. It is run by Simon's Treasury. This was never foreign aid. It was a money management program. A congressional audit in 1979 laid out the plumbing. The American experts sent to Saudi Arabia were paid almost entirely out of something called the Saudi Arabian Trust Account, Saudi money deposited inside the United States Treasury itself, which means the entire operation sat outside the congressional appropriations process. Hundreds of American civil servants working in the desert paid with Saudi dollars parked in Washington. 6 days after the signing, on June 14, 1974, Richard Nixon himself lands in Jeddah, a president 2 months from resignation, fleeing Watergate into foreign policy. Faisal receives him on the tarmac. At the state dinner, Nixon reaches for poetry. Quote, we can use oil, but we need more, something that is worth far more than oil. We need wisdom. Now mark this carefully, because the entire final act of this film turns on it. That joint commission, the thing actually signed in June 1974, contains not one word, not one clause, not one syllable about the currency in which oil is sold. The United States government's own auditors would later confirm it. Remember that? The handshake was the cover. The real business came 5 weeks later, behind closed doors, in the July heat of Jeddah, and this is the critical detail that changes everything. 4 days. That is what Simon and Parsky have when the plane comes down in Jeddah. 4 days of negotiation in a kingdom that months earlier had been rationing America's fuel to solve both halves of the equation at once. The framework they put on the table, as reconstructed by Bloomberg from declassified records and interviews, is elegantly simple. The United States will buy Saudi oil and supply the kingdom with weapons, equipment, and, implicitly, protection. And in return, Saudi Arabia will take its swelling billions of petrodollars and plow them into United States Treasury bonds. America's deficit will be financed by the very crisis that created it. King Faisal says yes on one condition, and the condition is recorded in a diplomatic cable. The kingdom's purchases of American debt must remain, quote, strictly secret. Understand his position. Faisal is the guardian of Mecca, the paymaster of the Arab cause, the man who imposed the embargo over Israel. If it becomes known that Arab oil money is flowing into the U.S. Treasury, the same Treasury funding aid to Israel, the accusation writes itself. The king is financing his enemy. The cable spells out that fear. Secrecy is not a preference. It is the price. So how do you hide the largest bond buyer in the world inside the most scrutinized financial market on earth? The Treasury's answer was a mechanism so discreet, it barely has a name. They called it the add-on. Follow the mechanics. A normal Treasury auction is competitive and public, every dollar announced, every result published. Impossible to hide a giant inside it. So Saudi Arabia's central bank would not bid in the auctions at all. It would buy outside them, through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in addition to the announced amounts added on. Here is what that looked like in practice. From the records of the era, the Treasury announces a borrowing of, say, $800 million. The auction runs. And then two unidentified central banks quietly take $400 million each through add-ons. The entire announced amount a second time over, bought outside the auction. Those purchases are excluded from the official totals.
On paper, they never happened.
And the concealment went one layer deeper. Every month, the Treasury publishes statistics on which countries hold America's debt. Japan's holdings, published. Britain's, published. But Saudi Arabia's were fused into a single anonymous line labeled oil exporters, blended with 14 other countries, Kuwait, the Emirates, Nigeria, and more, so that no one could tell who owned what. Simon would later justify that to Congress. Regional reporting, he told the hearing, was, quote, the only way in which Saudi Arabia would agree to participate. The blunter formulation came from Congress's auditors. Investigating in 1979, they found the United States had made, quote, special commitments of financial confidentiality to Saudi Arabia, a dry sentence for a promise no other creditor was given. Why bend this far? Because the competition was ferocious. Gordon Brown, an American diplomat, no relation to the British Prime Minister, was economic officer at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh from 1976 to 1978 and put the era bluntly, quote, everyone in the U.S., France, Britain, Japan was trying to get their fingers in the Saudis' pockets. Whoever captured the surplus captured the decade. The political scientist David Spiro, who spent years reconstructing this arrangement, adds the darker footnote. By hiding the flows, Washington was violating its own transparency commitments to its closest allies. It had promised the developed world openness about capital movements. It chose the Saudi money instead. And the machine worked beyond expectations. By 1977, 3 years in, Saudi Arabia had accumulated roughly 20% of all United States Treasury debt held by foreigners. 1/5 of America's foreign-held debt hidden behind 2 words in a table, and essentially nobody outside the Treasury knew. Then, on the 25th of March, 1975, the man who demanded the secret was gone. King Faisal, receiving visitors in Riyadh, was shot dead by his own nephew. The king died. The secret did not. The system he had insisted upon simply carried on without him, which tells you it was never really about one man. There was one serious attempt to drag it into the light. In 1979, the General Accounting Office, Congress's auditors, known today as the Government Accountability Office, concluded there was, quote, no statistical or legal basis for the Treasury's special treatment of Saudi Arabia. The Treasury stonewalled. The auditors never got access to the Saudi files. Stephen McSpadden, a congressional counsel who fought those battles, recalled it decades later. Quote, it was clear the Treasury people weren't going to cooperate at all. I'd been at the subcommittee for 17 years, and I'd never seen anything like that. Congress blinked. The line item stayed anonymous, and the arrangement settled in, because by then the other half of the bargain was being delivered on a scale nobody could ignore. Weapons. Between 1950 and 1969, 2 full decades, American military sales to Saudi Arabia totaled $218 million. By 1970, the annual figure to Riyadh was $14.8 million. By 1972, $296 million. Then, the flood. Across the Middle East and the Persian Gulf as a whole, more than $19 billion in American defense articles and services were sold in roughly the 4 years after October 1973. The region's arms imports quadrupled in real terms during the 1970s, while the world's merely doubled. And in 1978 came the crown jewel for Riyadh, 60 F-15 fighters. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built entire military cities in the desert, paid for out of that same trust account of Saudi money sitting in Washington. Carrot and stick, fused into a single message. Park your surplus with us, and you are protected. Not targeted, protected. But a bilateral bargain with one kingdom, however rich, does not by itself make the whole world buy oil in dollars. For that, the pricing itself had to hold. And here is where the threads converge. Because in the mid-1970s, OPEC very nearly walked away from the dollar altogether. It was never a secret debate. Through 1975, with the dollar sliding, every barrel priced in dollars was a barrel losing value for the man who sold it. At OPEC's summit in Libreville, Gabon, in June 1975, the cartel openly discussed abandoning the dollar, switching the pricing of oil to the IMF's basket of currencies, the SDR. The Federal Reserve was worried enough to circulate internal memos on OPEC currency schemes. A 1978 essay in Foreign Affairs was bluntly titled OPEC and the Dollar Dilemma. So why did they stay? Not because of any treaty. Remember, there was none. They stayed because of three facts, each of them an incentive, none of them a signature. First, their reserves were already in dollars. Repricing oil away from the dollar would devalue their own treasure, like a man who owns a warehouse of gold voting to crash the gold price. Second, only one market on Earth, the U.S. Treasury market, was deep enough to absorb surpluses of that size without breaking. And third, the American security umbrella priced into every F-15. Jahangir Amuzegar, who wrote that Foreign Affairs essay, ran the sums. Switching to the SDR in June 1975 would have cost OPEC $20 to $27 billion by early 1978. Leaving the dollar was not a rebellion. It was a bill. Hold on to that because it is the key to the entire film. There was no contract. There was something far stronger than a contract. Nobody had an interest in leaving. And be precise about what dollar pricing does, because this is where the myth gets built. A price written in dollars forces nobody to hold dollars. A refinery in Japan or Germany can pay a dollar-priced cargo out of yen or euros because the market for converting them is deep, liquid, and open every day of the week. So dollar invoicing creates no obligation. It creates a habit, a permanent worldwide demand for dollars to transact in, and a reason for central banks to hold some marginal on any single barrel, immense across all of them, forever. That is not an anchor. Nothing anchors the dollar, and nothing has since 1971. It is something less solid, and as it turned out, more durable, a reason to keep using it. But there was another dimension to this, and it is the one the celebrations always leave out. The dollars did not stop in Riyadh, and they did not all go into treasuries, and where the rest of them went, they built a bomb with a 10-year fuse. From 1974 to 1981, OPEC's accumulated surplus reached roughly $450 billion. What didn't go into U.S. government debt flooded into the great New York banks and the offshore Eurodollar market in London. And the banks then faced the same question the sheikdoms had. Where do you put money this big? The man with the loudest answer was Walter Wriston of Citibank, the most influential banker of his generation. The banks, he assured the world, could handle the recycling, and his case in the 1970s was technical. The surpluses were liquid. The developing world was growing fast. Sovereign borrowers serviced their loans, lend to governments, and sleep well. So Citibank built the greatest sovereign lending machine in history, and the money poured south. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, the Philippines, borrowing recycled petrodollars by the tens of billions at floating interest rates pegged to London. As long as rates stayed low, the machine hummed. Then Paul Volcker, the man from the Camp David room in 1971, now chairman of the Federal Reserve, set out to kill American inflation by driving interest rates toward 20%. Every floating rate loan on the planet repriced overnight. And commodity prices, the borrower's lifeline, collapsed at the same moment. The numbers tell you everything. Latin America's external debt, $29 billion at the end of 1970, $327 billion by 1982, 11-fold in 12 years, largely plumbed through the petrodollar pipes. Thursday, August 12, 1982. Mexico's finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, telephones three men, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the secretary of the Treasury, and the managing director of the IMF. Mexico, he tells them, cannot meet its obligation on the 16th. The debt behind it is roughly $80 billion. He closes the foreign exchange market. On Friday the 13th, he flies to Washington. History remembers it as the Mexican weekend. Now savor the irony. The banks that had recycled OPEC's money were staring into the abyss. By 1982, The 9 largest American banks were carrying Latin American debt equal to 176% of their capital. Their whole existence lent out and gone nearly twice over. The concentration was worse. By October 1983, the 4 biggest debtors, Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, owed commercial banks $176 billion, and $37 billion of that was owed to the 8 largest U.S. banks alone, 147% of their capital and reserves. In August 1982, the Fed convened an emergency meeting of central bankers from around the world to put together a bridge loan for Mexico. The FDIC's historians would later call it the gravest threat to the international banking system since the Great Depression.
And Riston?
In September 1982, weeks after the phone call from Mexico City, he went into print with the line that would follow him to his grave. Countries don't go bankrupt. Companies fail, people fail, but a nation never. He was still saying it in 1983. Note the order. The slogan was not the dogma that inflated the bubble, it was the defense mounted after it burst. Latin America sank into what it still calls the lost decade, paid for link by link through the same pipes that had saved the dollar in 1974. And through all of it, the boom, the bust, the bailouts, the founding arrangements stayed buried. It took until 2016, and one reporter's stubbornness to open the vault. January 2016, oil prices have collapsed again, and the markets are asking the obvious question about the world's biggest exporter: how much U.S. debt does Saudi Arabia actually hold? And a Bloomberg journalist named Andrea Wong realizes the astonishing answer. Nobody knows. Japan's number is public, China's is public, Britain's is public. Saudi Arabia, a creditor of the United States for 4 decades, is still hidden inside oil exporters, exactly as arranged in 1974. She files a Freedom of Information request. While it works its way through the Treasury, the temperature rises. That April, the New York Times reports Riyadh has warned American lawmakers it could liquidate up to $750 billion in U.S. assets if Congress lets 9/11 families sue the kingdom. Suddenly, everyone wants the number. Nobody has it. Then, in May 2016, for the first time in 42 years, the Treasury publishes the line, $116.8 billion. And here is the twist nobody expected. It was small, that put Saudi Arabia 13th among America's foreign creditors, behind Ireland, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Brazil, nowhere near China or Japan with their trillion apiece. 4 decades of secrecy, and the number underneath was ordinary. Unless it isn't. A former Treasury official told Bloomberg the true Saudi position, routed through offshore centers and third-party managers, may be double that or more. The line the Treasury finally published may still not be the answer. One more detail deserves respect. The scholar David Spiro had pieced together the essentials of this story back in 1999, in the hidden hand of American hegemony, working from indirect evidence, without the documents. The 2016 disclosure, pried out of the Treasury by a FOIA request, largely confirmed the academic 17 years later. Sometimes the conspiracy theorist is just a careful researcher waiting for the archive to catch up. Now, I want to be careful here because this is not a crude conspiracy story, and it would be dishonest to sell it as one. There was no smoke-filled room where men in dark suits decreed the fate of the world currency system. The secret of 1974 was real and documented, but it was one arrangement between 2 governments, born of mutual desperation, not a master plan. And serious historians genuinely disagree about how much it mattered. On one side stands Spiro, who argues the recycling was never a neutral market outcome, but a deliberate exercise of American power, a hidden hand, as opposed to the market's invisible one. On the other side stand skeptics like Brad Setzer of the Council on Foreign Relations, who argues the petrodollar was never the true pillar of the dollar at all. The dollar dominates in this view because American capital markets are the deepest on earth, because the institutions hold, and because there has never been a serious alternative, and because, as Setzer points out, nothing stops anyone paying for oil in euros anyway. The skeptics have numbers too. The great Saudi surpluses were gone by the late 1980s, and the kingdom now issues bonds rather than hoarding treasuries. The Gulf's surplus is dwarfed by Asia's. The IMF reckoned Riyadh needed oil near $96 a barrel just to balance its budget in 2024. The petrostate that once financed America now borrows like everybody else. The honest verdict is somewhere in between. The deal was real, the secrecy was real, and it was one pillar under the dollar, not the whole foundation. Which brings us back at last to June 2024 and the myth of the expired treaty. The claim, as it raced across the internet, was precise. A 50-year U.S.-Saudi petrodollar agreement expired on June 9, 2024, and Riyadh would now sell oil in yuan. The posts appear to have originated in Chinese-language accounts before crossing into English-speaking finance media, and the claim is false. dismantled by PolitiFact, by Radio Free Asia, by analysts across the spectrum. No treaty ever required Saudi oil to be sold in dollars. Nothing existed that could expire. But here's what makes the myth so revealing. Something did turn 50 in June 2024. The Joint Commission, the public handshake of June 8, 1974, an administrative framework for economic cooperation renewed routinely for decades. A GAO official confirmed it contained no formal agreement whatsoever about oil trading in dollars. The internet had found the cover story and mistaken it for the secret. The real arrangement, July 1974, Jeddah, the add-ons, the anonymity was never a treaty either, and that is the true lesson of this entire story. The petrodollar was never a pact. It was a system of incentives, weapons and protection in exchange for parked surpluses, dollar pricing sustained by habit, liquidity, and self-interest, secrecy sustained because every party needed it. A system without a contract cannot be cancelled. There is no document to tear up, no clause to invoke, no expiry date. But it can erode, and it is eroding, slowly, partial de-dollarization, reported discussions of yuan-priced sales, shrinking Saudi reserves. Yet, even now, roughly 80% of the world's oil is still invoiced in dollars, and the Saudi rial has been pegged to the dollar since 1986. 50 years on, what William Simon built in 4 days in Jeddah is still standing precisely because nobody ever signed anything. You cannot resign from an arrangement that does not officially exist. You can only stop believing in it. And, so far, the world still believes. So, here's my question for you. The next time someone tells you a 50-year secret treaty just expired, ask them the question this film asked: who signed it? And if no one signed it, what is actually holding it up? Tell me in the comments what you think replaces this system, if anything ever does. I read every one of them. If you made it this far, drop an oil barrel in the comments so I know you stayed to the end. And if this kind of deep dive is why you come here, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.